Spring of 1942. Somewhere on the road between a crashed Wellington bomber and a transit camp in occupied Europe. A young flight sergeant stands with his arms raised while a German soldier works through his uniform with the patience of a man who has done this 100 times before. Pockets are turned out. Boots are pulled apart at the heel. The lining of his battle dress is run between finger and thumb, searching for the telltale crackle of paper. Money is confiscated. A penknife is confiscated. And then the search moves to the buttons, because by now the guards have learned that British buttons sometimes hold secrets. This particular button survives the inspection. It is brass, slightly tarnished, indistinguishable in weight and shine from every other button on the tunic, and the guard moves on without a second glance. He has just handled, without knowing it, a tiny, magnetized needle capable of pointing this man towards home. No shot has been fired. No alarm has been raised. And yet, in that single moment of a guard's indifference, an escape has quietly begun. This is the story of the button compass, and of the strange, secretive British workshop that turned a tunic fastening into one of the most effective pieces of escape equipment of the Second World War. To understand why something so small mattered so much, it helps to go back to the previous war. During the First World War, British servicemen who escaped captivity did so almost entirely through their own ingenuity, with little organized support from home and even less interest from the authorities once they returned. Debriefings, where they happened at all, were cursory. Lessons were not gathered. Equipment was not designed. When the Second World War began in September 1939, a small group within British military intelligence decided this would not happen again, and on December 23 that year, a new section was formed with a single, narrowly defined purpose: to help Allied servicemen escape capture, or avoid it altogether, and to bring them home. It became known by its administrative shorthand, MI9, and almost nobody outside a small circle of officials had any idea it existed. The scale of the problem MI9 faced was sobering. As the Royal Air Force began flying bombing operations deeper into German-held territory, the number of aircrew shot down over hostile ground climbed steadily. A man parachuting from a stricken aircraft over occupied France or the Low Countries might survive the fall only to find himself hundreds of kilometers from friendly territory, without local language, without local currency, and without the faintest idea which direction led to safety. The arithmetic of escape, once examined closely, was brutal. Of roughly 10,000 Royal Air Force prisoners of war held in German hands, only around 30 ever achieved what airmen called a full home run, escaping captivity and making it all the way back to Allied territory. Existing solutions did almost nothing to improve those odds. A standard military compass was heavy, metallic, and instantly recognizable to any guard who patted down a prisoner's kit. Carrying one was practically an admission of intent. Maps were worse still since paper rustled, tore in the rain, and dissolved into pulp if a man had to wade across a river or hide in a ditch through a downpour. Food was scarce on both sides of the front line, and a man on the run with no rations rarely lasted more than a few days before hunger forced him into a farmhouse, a checkpoint, or a betrayal. There was a second, quieter problem sitting underneath the first one, which was that nobody at the War Office had ever systematically studied how escapes actually succeeded or failed. Hutton's section began by combing through memoirs and after-action accounts from the previous conflict, even enlisting sixth-form pupils at a school in Rugby to summarize old escape narratives when time was short, and a serving colonel passed along the text of a 1937 lecture by a senior German general describing how his own country had run prisoner-of-war camps 2 decades earlier. From this unlikely patchwork of borrowed research, a clearer picture emerged of exactly what an escaping man needed, and, more usefully, what tended to get him caught. One of MI9's early advisors, a veteran of escape attempts in the previous war, summarized the problem in 3 blunt words: maps, compasses, food. Without all three, an evading serviceman was simply a fugitive with no plan. With them, hidden cleverly enough to survive a search, he had a fighting chance. The trouble was that nobody in 1939 had the faintest idea how to make a magnetic compass small enough to vanish inside a button, a pipe, or a pencil, while still pointing reliably north after weeks of rough handling, damp, and cold. It sounded, to the instrument makers MI9 first approached, like an impossible request. Several of Britain's most established compass manufacturers turned the work down outright, either because their machine tools could not work at such a minute scale or because they simply could not move fast enough for a war that was already underway. The challenge, in other words, needed someone willing to improvise where established industry had refused even to try. That someone was Christopher Clayton Hutton, a former Royal Flying Corps pilot turned journalist and film publicist, recruited into MI9's small technical section and given remarkable freedom to organize his own priorities. Colleagues remembered him as willfully eccentric and occasionally impossible to work with, a man of what one historian later called tempestuous brilliance, who would rather spend his own money to solve a problem than wait weeks for a government department to approve the funds. Around the time of the Dunkirk evacuation, Hutton turned his attention to the compass problem and, after being rebuffed by the larger instrument firms, found an unlikely partner in a modest London workshop called Blunt Brothers, tucked behind unremarkable premises on the Old Kent Road. Behind that ordinary frontage sat a fully equipped scientific laboratory employing close to 1,000 people, with the precision machining skill Hutton needed. He supplied the firm with several hundred meters of high-strength steel, and within a week the workshop had turned it into 5,000 magnetized bars, each destined to become the working heart of a miniature compass. What Blunt Brothers achieved next was a genuine feat of small-scale engineering. They produced compass housings barely a quarter of an inch across, smaller than a shirt button, each containing a magnetized needle delicate enough to swing freely, yet robust enough to survive being carried through mud, rain, and rough searches for months on end. Hutton's breakthrough was not the compass itself, but where to put it. He realized that a standard military tunic already carried something every guard expected to see, and almost nobody thought to examine closely: a row of plain brass buttons. By machining a button in two halves, with the back section hollowed out to hold the tiny compass and the whole assembly held together by a fine screw thread, MI9 created a navigational instrument that was, to the eye and to the hand, simply a button. Turn it the wrong way, in the ordinary clockwise direction anyone would instinctively try, and nothing happened at all. The two halves were designed to separate only when turned the opposite way, a small piece of psychological engineering layered on top of the mechanical one. The button compass quickly became the signature device, but it was only the most famous member of an entire family of concealments that poured out of Hutton's section. Compasses were hidden inside the mouthpieces of pipes, protected by rubber so the pipe could still be smoked. They were built into the caps of fountain pens, into collar studs, into cufflinks, into the eraser end of pencils that had to be snapped at a precise point to release the tiny needle inside. Ordinary razor blades were secretly magnetized so that, floated on still water, the manufacturer's name stamped into the steel would settle pointing towards true north. Even confectionery was pressed into service, with compasses small enough to be hidden among sweets in a parcel. Working in parallel, Hutton's team solved the map problem by turning to silk, a material that did not rustle, did not disintegrate in water, and could be folded into a space barely larger than a folded handkerchief, then stitched invisibly into the lining of a battle-dress jacket. By one historian's careful count, MY9 was eventually responsible for at least 240 distinct mapping items, resulting in something approaching 2 million silk and tissue maps reaching Allied hands by the war's end, though exact totals remain difficult to verify given how much of the program stayed classified for decades after the guns fell silent. Production figures for the compasses themselves are similarly hazy, with various post-war accounts suggesting well over 1 million were manufactured between 1942 and 1945. though MI9's own records were never fully opened to public scrutiny, and some figures rest on the recollections of those who served rather than on surviving paperwork. Getting these devices to men already sitting behind barbed wire required a different kind of cunning altogether. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to receive parcels from relatives and from recognized charitable organizations, and AI9 simply invented charities that did not exist, complete with convincing letterheads and addresses chosen, with a certain dark humor among buildings that had already been bombed flat and would never be visited by anyone checking up on them. Through these fictitious bodies, ordinary-looking comforts found their way into camps across occupied Europe. The game's manufacturer Waddington's quietly produced special editions of board games in which silk maps, miniature compasses, and genuine foreign currency were sealed inside the board itself, with a discrete colored marking identifying which version of the game corresponded to which region of occupied territory. A deck of playing cards from an American manufacturer, soaked in water, could be peeled apart layer by layer to reveal sections of a hidden map. Even a gramophone record was hollowed out to smuggle escape materials past camp censors who had no reason to suspect a stack of innocent shellac discs sent to relieve the boredom of captivity. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. Documenting the precise role these devices played in any single escape is harder than it might seem, because the men who used them were rarely in a position to keep detailed records while on the run, and many MI9 files remained sealed for decades after 1945. What evidence survives points consistently to compasses and silk maps being treated as a standard kit for aircrew operating over enemy territory, carried almost automatically by the time of the major bomber offensives. The most famous escape of the war, the mass breakout from Stalag Luft 3 in March 1944, later dramatized on film, drew on forged papers, concealed compasses and maps that historians have traced back to MI9's supply chain, even though most of the 76 men who broke out that night were recaptured within days and 50 were executed on Hitler's direct order. At Colditz Castle, prisoners are known to have used compasses hidden inside hollowed-out walnuts and chess pieces with secret compartments, items that survive today in museum collections as physical proof of a system that worked in spirit even when individual attempts failed. The psychological effect on the prisoners themselves is, in some ways, better documented than the material one. Simply knowing that a hidden compass sat inside a tunic button, waiting, gave men something to plan around in conditions designed to strip away every shred of agency they had left. Camp diaries and post-war interviews repeatedly describe an almost ritual quality to checking a hidden device was still intact, a small private act of defiance carried out within sight of guards who had no idea it was happening at all. For men whose days were otherwise governed entirely by someone else's schedule, that quiet act of ownership mattered as much as the compass itself ever did. It is worth being honest about the limits of the surviving record here. MI9's own files were not declassified for decades. Many of the men who carried these devices never spoke of them publicly, and a great deal of what historians now know has been pieced together from museum donations, family attics, and the occasional candid memoir written long after the war had become history rather than memory. Numbers that sound precise in popular accounts, such as exact compass production totals or exact escape counts attributable to a single device, should generally be read as careful estimates rather than verified statistics, and serious historians treat them accordingly. Set against German efforts in the same field, the British program stands out for its sheer variety and industrial scale, rather than for any single technological leap the Germans could not match. German forces did produce their own escape compasses for Luftwaffe airmen, similar in basic design to early British models, but in far smaller numbers and with nothing like the same range of concealments. Part of the explanation is circumstantial rather than technical. For much of the war, Germany held air superiority over its own occupied territories. So far, fewer German airmen found themselves shot down deep in hostile country with a pressing need to evade capture. The Americans, by contrast, built something closely resembling Hutton's operation once their own air crews began flying alongside the Royal Air Force over Europe. A secretive unit known internally as the Escape Factory, based at a requisitioned property outside Washington and identified only by a post office box number, took the lead in producing escape aids for American forces, particularly in the Pacific Theater, while in Europe it made more practical sense to simply equip American aircrew from British stocks rather than duplicate the supply chain. The American devices that did emerge, hidden compasses tucked into hairbrushes, hollowed-out baseballs, and tiny radio components smuggled piecemeal into camps, borrowed heavily from techniques Hutton's section had already pioneered, a quiet acknowledgement that the British had simply got there first and got there more thoroughly. Assessing the true historical impact of the button compass demands a degree of honesty about what can and cannot be proven. MI9 as a whole has been credited with helping somewhere in the region of 35,000 Allied servicemen escape capture or evade it altogether and return to Allied territory, a figure that covers the entire apparatus of escape lines, forged papers, safe houses, and resistance networks rather than the compass alone, and it would be dishonest to claim a single button accounted for that number on its own. What can be said with more confidence is that the compass and its companion devices removed one of the most basic obstacles facing any man trying to move undetected across hostile ground at night, and that the system's German countermeasures tell their own story. Once enemy interrogators discovered that some buttons could be unscrewed to reveal a hidden compass, MI9 responded by reversing the screw thread, so that a guard's instinctive attempt to open it the ordinary way only tightened it further, a small mechanical inversion that speaks volumes about how seriously both sides took this quiet contest. The design proved durable enough that its basic principle, a magnetized needle hidden inside an everyday object, survives almost unchanged in compasses issued to military personnel to this day, the lineage running in an almost unbroken line from a wartime workshop on the Old Kent Road to small, jewel-bearinged button compasses still carried by special forces and survivalists alike. Surviving examples of the wartime originals, along with the chess sets, walnuts, and playing cards that carried their companion devices, can be seen today in collections including the Imperial War Museum in London, the RAF Museum, and the museum at Colditz Castle itself, now open to visitors who can examine the very mechanisms that once had to pass unnoticed under a guard's fingers. Picture that flight sergeant again, standing on the roadside with his arms still raised, the search now finished, the guard already turning towards the next prisoner in the line. Nothing about that moment looks dramatic. There is no explosion, no chase, no clash of weapons, nothing that would survive as a single dramatic photograph in a newspaper archive. What there is, instead, is a tiny needle resting inside a brass button, patient and indifferent to the war raging around it, simply waiting to point towards north the moment someone needed it to. That patience was the entire point. MI9's engineers never set out to win a single battle. They set out to give ordinary, frightened, exhausted men one small private advantage that no search, however thorough, was ever quite thorough enough to find. Some of those men used their compasses and made it home. Many more carried them for months and never had the chance, captured too completely, watched too closely, or simply unlucky in the geography of where their aircraft happened to come down. Yet the compass did its work regardless, because its true purpose was never solely about the journey home. It was about giving a man something to hold on to in his own pocket, literally and otherwise, at the exact moment everything else had been taken from him. No shot was ever fired by a button compass. No enemy was ever wounded by a silk map sewn into a lining, or by a chess piece with a hollow center, or by a gramophone record packed with paper instead of music. There was no detonation, no casualty list, no headline. And yet, scattered across prison camps from Poland to the Rhine, These small, unremarkable objects helped chip away at an enemy's total control over the men it held, one quiet, undetected button at a time. They did not win the war. Nobody who built them ever claimed they did. What they did, again and again, in pockets and linings and the backs of buttons across occupied Europe, was give frightened, exhausted men a fighting chance where none had existed before, and ask absolutely nothing of them in return except the steady nerve to keep walking towards a heading only they knew they were following. That is the story of the gadget history almost forgot. Not a weapon at all, but a passport to freedom.